Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bombe wash processed Ethiopia from Bugan Coffee Lab. And there's the bag right there. And Bugan, based out of Bergamo, Italy. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. They're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This coffee was part of the Coffee Vines April 2024 subscription box, and since we've somehow never reviewed any Italian-based coffee roaster, it felt like a great opportunity to finally review one. So it'll be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. Brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. It is a little interesting. While doing some research for this video, I took a look at their website and I saw that they do tend to offer their coffees on the lighter side of things. But as you can see right here, this one is also an omni roasted coffee, which is to say that it's not quite as light as that might have indicated going into this review. But with that being said, I could say that it's somewhat on par with that Craft House coffee that we had recently reviewed, if maybe a little bit lighter than that one. So I feel like most people would align this with being on the more medium light side of things, and kind of somewhere in between that range, as it's not necessarily the lightest coffee, and I do feel like a lot of their coffees would be lighter than this one right here. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it offered an interesting, slightly papery quality to it at the forefront, with a slight bit of a roastiness within the finish that was made up for on the back end, with plenty of the listed bergamot as well as peachiness in the finish as well. Clean otherwise, but for the most part, it left a nice first impression as there were an abundance of fruit qualities within this one. Day 21 opted for the Chemex, and the cup has opened up a little bit more with more of the floral aspects right off brew, as well as a fresh fruit present within the finish itself. The roasty and developed qualities are still very much present, especially within the cool down of this coffee, as the fruit profile remains delicate otherwise, with some slightly soft tropicality as well as stone fruit components to it. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup has been pretty similar up to this point, still offering that slight papery quality. And a little bit of a side note on that, I feel like sometimes people describe that as being reminiscent of kiwi, and for me that's why I often associate the two flavor profiles in line with each other, tropicality and that slight kiwi component with that papery quality to it, because I've seen a lot of coffees and had a lot of coffees that had that note specifically listed on there, and then that's essentially what it reminded me of. So that's what I was experiencing within this coffee, but in addition to that, there's a slight smokiness yet again with more of the peachiness in the finish. Listed jasmine felt apt, as there was an abundance of florality, and I feel like that's the best defining factor of this one. Day 27 through the V60 with the Coffee Vines recipe, which was a high concentration and some lower temperatures, and it's improved a lot with much better definition to the peachiness and florality. That slightly papery tropical quality and the developed qualities are still present, but in a much more palatable sense, as the cup was beginning to skew a little bit more on the cleaner side of things, so notably better. Definitely some improvement with that adjustment. We move on to day 30 as we opted for the Chemex with the Coffee Vines recipe, and it's back to being a little bit more muted with a slight focus on that papery quality yet again. And I keep going back to it because I feel like that's the first thing I tasted with this coffee, and pretty much every single day it continued to get that quality within this one. So present on this day yet again, with the development still feeling like it's focused on, I would say, being reminiscent of some tea-like savory aspects within this one, which I can say is expected with a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. We move on to day 33 as we opted for the V60, and struggles continued with this one as it's offering much more of that papery taste quality to it yet again, with a slight bitterness to the citric component and a bit more tea-like aspects as well. So I felt like some adjustments were needed, because I said we're trending in the right direction by adjusting it to the Coffee Vines recipe, but as we tried that again, I'm like, I'm not entirely sure if this is necessarily the direction to go, because I'm getting a slight bit of inconsistency with these brews. We continue on to day 36 as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best that it had been up to this point, and it's the main reason we opted to go with this recipe going forward, as there was much more clarity and increase in the overall fruitiness of the cup and a much better defined stone fruit aspect. So I feel like this kind of lent itself towards the notion that it just needed a fair bit more time for this coffee to maybe open up a little bit more. And that definitely happened, as there was plenty of the peach-like aspects with the listed jasmine also present. That slight papery and citric quality, both of which were toned down, resulting in a huge improvement, as I didn't even necessarily feel as much of the developed qualities within this one. Day 39, back through the Chemex, and more positive aspects yet again, as it has really nice depth, and this time I'm picking up a lot more from this coffee, so it really seems to improve with just an extra bit of time, as the listed grape felt the most apt it had been up to this point in a slightly more subtle sense. But outside of that, there's a really nice mix of citrus, floral, and stone fruit aspects, all with a nice candied aspect to them. And this is, I would say, one of the few times from this point going forward where I was starting to feel this coffee being a little bit more candied sweet. And that was a really nice benefit to it, as in addition to that, there's a slight bit of a tea-like savoriness and a slight honeysuckle aspect to the cup as well, just giving this one a lot more depth, especially relative to some of the earlier experiences we had had with this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through them, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. We are working with a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, and I feel like on paper going into it, you'd fully expect it to have a really clean profile to it. And I feel like working through some things really helped it achieve that true level 4 mark, though at no point would I say that it was ever necessarily in danger of not reaching that level 4, as it's a pretty clean coffee, especially when you're getting a lot of the floral aspects. And while it had an interesting, as I described, tropical papery quality to it, I think that even then it was in a much more clean sense, as there isn't anything that really kind of takes away from that. Definitely a level 4 on this one. Finish, level 4. And as I'm drinking this coffee today, I can definitely feel a little bit more of those tea-like savory aspects within the finish, as the fruit profile for me at the most part comes at the forefront of this coffee. There are times where it's a little bit more present within the finish, especially the peachy quality, though I do have to say that that's at slightly warmer temperatures than what I'm drinking this coffee at now. So definitely a little bit more in that savory tea-like aspect in terms of that finish. Sweetness, level 4. This one was surprisingly sweet, and oftentimes when it comes to wash-processed Ethiopian coffees, I can be a little let down by them lacking the sort of sweetness that I'm looking for. But this one, the sweetness came in a number of different directions. The candied aspect to it, the floral aspect to it, and then in addition to that, of course, the fruit-like aspect, which I would say was maybe the sweetest component within this one. And when we get to the fruit components, we'll discuss that a little further in depth, but plenty of sweetness within this coffee. Florality, level 4. And once again, they have the jasmine note list on here. Fully see that, though towards the end, once again, I was experiencing a little bit more of that honeysuckle-like component to it as well, which is good. Multiple different floral aspects to a coffee is always going to be a bonus for me, as that's something associated usually with Ethiopian and Panamanian coffees. Citrus fruit, level 4. And they have a bergamot note list on here, and I can't necessarily say that bergamot was the first thing that does come to mind. I feel like this one may be a little bit more of a generic citric quality to it, mostly because it's somewhere in that intermediary between that lime-like component, and I feel like that reason is why you could justify putting something like a bergamot on there. Even then, I wouldn't necessarily say that it is something that's overly well-defined within this coffee. It's just a little bit more of a, we'll say, more green-like citric component to it. Stone fruit, level 4. At its best, this coffee was very well defined and very well pronounced in terms of that stone fruit aspect. And if I recall correctly, I believe the note they have listed on here is apricot. And I didn't necessarily see that for me when I was experiencing this stone fruit quality. It was in a much more fresh fruit, pronounced peachy-like sense to it. And when I was experiencing it, especially in abundance, it was definitely the best that this coffee had to offer. So level 4 felt pretty justified within this coffee, especially on a lot of the times where it was the most pronounced characteristic to this one. Bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, and as I was making this tasting wheel, I continued to taste it and say, is there supposed to be more brightness to this coffee? But I don't think that was never necessarily something that I was going to experience a lot of within this one. Level 3 felt like the best place to put it. Caramel level 3, that is discussing the candied aspect of this one, which I mentioned kind of grew over time. At the first couple of days that I'd had from this coffee, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was an overly candied cup of coffee. I feel like it was still kind of working through a combination of some slightly developed as well as papery qualities to it, but with a little bit more time, it seems to open up in that direction. And then savoriness, level 3. I've already mentioned that that's in relation to the tea-like aspects of this one. Definitely an abundance of that, and I'm kind of curious that there isn't any sort of tea-like note on here, though I could say that maybe like a jasmine tea sort of component makes a lot of sense within this one, as I was definitely experiencing a fair bit of those characteristics. I would say even more so than some of the listed berry qualities that they have on here, which of course insinuates that slight grape component that I was experiencing in a more subtle sense. And then final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 1. And as I was making this tasting wheel, I couldn't help but notice that there wasn't necessarily too much, we'll say, texture within this one. Definitely more of those tea-like aspects, which I had mentioned, a little bit more of a tea-like body to this one. And obviously that could be a result of brewing this one with the Chemex as well. And of course that it is wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've said in the past that I don't really enjoy reviewing wash-processed Ethiopian coffees, mostly because I've kind of hit a ceiling for how good wash-processed Ethiopian coffees are. But I think it's really nice that we haven't reviewed too many of them this year, mostly because it's resulted in me taking a break. And anytime I do return to these wash-processed Ethiopian coffees, I'm kind of reminded of why I enjoy them so much in the first place. I mean, who doesn't enjoy a good wash-processed Ethiopian coffee? And I feel like this one, especially towards the end, did exceed my expectations ever so slightly. I noticed a huge improvement with this one with time, and with some slight adjustments to it as well. So for that reason, I think it just kind of built upon itself right from that initial first impression. And I'm very curious about this coffee roaster too, for a number of reasons, because looking at their website, as I mentioned, they do list that they'd like to roast on the lighter side of things. And in addition to that, they have some very interesting coffees on their website. I'm not entirely sure if I'll get an opportunity to revisit them anytime here in the near future, but at the very least, I will keep an eye out to see if maybe they might have some more interesting coffees coming up. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like this one's a pretty straightforward wash-processed Ethiopian coffee in a number of ways. It's offering great clarity, really nice sweetness, an abundance of florality, and then some great fruit depth as well. So it's hitting on the 4 marks that I'm looking for, and that's probably one of the big reasons why I enjoyed this coffee a little bit more than the average coffee in general. I would say keep in mind the profile of this one. It's not necessarily going to be the lightest coffee, though, as I kind of insinuated. I think that they do have much lighter coffees than this one as well. But if that's kind of the direction you can look for a coffee, especially with lighter body, that's the best direction I can point you towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bombe wash-processed Ethiopia from Bugan Coffee Lab. Thank you for watching.